those quiet and resigned words of Mary, Luther says, are for us. We in that story are the servants of God. So her commandment, do what the Lord tells you. We are called to let go and to simply trust in God's goodness and do what we know we are called to do. And of course, from this story in John, when the servants do follow the Lord's instruction, as strange as they seem, this filling the water jugs up, that's when the miracle happens. Water is turned into wine. In God's time, through the power of God's grace, our deepest doubts, our dread, and our worry can turn to joy and celebration. This is what is happening. I am confident. I'm thinking this is happening even now in the scene there of the earthquake in Haiti, as rescue workers and food and water are beginning to arrive. People of faith there, I'm sure, will be able to see the miraculous work of the risen Christ in Haiti, as Church World Service and other Christian and secular aid organizations from around the world provide equipment and people and begin digging the victims out and restoring the injured to life. These images we've been seeing all week have been so horrific. Those collapsed buildings, bodies piled in the streets, those crying children who look like they're in whiteface for all the concrete dust in their face. But we have to ask ourselves, like the servants at the wedding banquet, what is the Lord telling us to do about it? I know many of you were calling or emailing me during the week, last week, to ask, what is the church doing? And that's why we've dedicated a page in the bulletin to explain how you can help by giving money through the church. It is almost as if we're being asked to turn wine into water. Because if we took the money that we might have spent on a glass of wine or a dinner out and sent it to Haiti, it can buy fresh drinking water and food rations for the homeless. But this was this week's disaster. I was moved to ask myself why we didn't help the people of Haiti before, or the people of a million other nations that are in need. And I thought, for one thing, like those servants who were called to fill those heavy jars with wash water, we don't expect it will feel good to follow God's commandment to love one another. We don't expect a miracle of transformation when we're willing to do the heavy lifting for God. But the truth of the wedding banquet, I think, is that doing what God commands is a source of real joy for those of us who call ourselves disciples. Like the good wine that Jesus provides, loving others as he calls us to do can be surprisingly delicious. Jesus calls us to fullness of life, but that is fullness of life in the service of humanity, not just the empty practice of religious tradition, symbolized in this story, I think, by the water jugs of the Jewish purification ritual. I think the empty pleasures that money can buy for us are like the cheap wine that the host might have been expected to provide the drunken party guests. When Jesus calls us to God's party, he invites us to help serve, to serve the best wine as his disciples. And to see the joy in the faces of those that we serve is deeply satisfying, intoxicating even. It's much better than chugging the cheap wine of worldly pleasures or sipping the plain wash water of empty religious duty. God's Spirit is wonderful and plentiful for all who trust in God to provide it. We are invited to set a feast of grace in the midst of the world's emptiness and sorrow. And when we're called to do that, we find it gives us great joy. It's addicting even. That's why so many of us love going on mission trips, why our women are even now in Rhode Island serving the poor. I just want to close with a story about one of the first mission trips that I helped to lead. It was up to Medford, Oregon, where our youth were in senior high were helping to repair some group homes for mentally disabled adults. We were staying in a little Baptist church out on the edge of town, and as it happened, it was next door to a farm, and with a farmhouse and this big red barn behind it that the family had evidently turned into a kind of clubhouse for their teenagers. So when we got there the first night, after supper, the kids were out with me in the parking lot, blowing off steam, playing some ultimate frisbee, running around and laughing. But there was loud rock music playing over at the barn. And out of the big hayloft window, we kept seeing these teenage boys looking out, scoping out our girls, holding what looked like beer cans in their hand. And finally, they started calling out to us, "Hey, hey!" And after ignoring them for a while, they finally got our attention, and they said, "You guys want to come over with us? You want to party with us? We have beer." So as a chaperone, I was curious how our kids would respond. But they continued to say no and ignore them. So the guys came over to the church parking lot, stood at the edge, and a couple of our girls went over to meet them. So I followed along at kind of chaperone distance and to hear what they'd say. So the girls, one of the lead girls says, "Oh, we can't come over," she says. "We're here on a work camp. We're doing service projects here in town." And the boy just looked kind of impressed. And he said, "Oh, sorry, man, that's a bummer. What did you do to get in trouble?" And that cracked us up because they just assumed that they were on some kind of service project in exchange for jail time. But when the girls said that they were there with a church youth group and that they not only wanted to be there, but that they had raised money all year and that they had actually paid to be there, those guys kind of looked pale and turned around and went home really fast. They just couldn't understand what it would mean to be invited to God's party. Loving and serving others is what we're called to do at God's party. And it's something we Christians want to do, not something we have to do. We are grateful always for the spirit of grace that comes to us, that fills us with the joy and enthusiasm to do what the church does, to give love to the world as generously as God's love was given to all of us through Jesus Christ. Thanks be to God for this good news. Amen.